The banker set the appraisal sheet on the desk and turned it so Nora could read it right side up. No well of record, no pond, no reliable stock water. "Nora," he said, "this ground can't carry cattle without water." She had come into town for this meeting knowing what the sheet would say before she saw it. She set an old folded deed on the desk beside it, the paper soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded for longer than she had been alive, and pointed to a line near the middle. "Water at the Walnut," she read. The banker leaned over it. "Where's the Walnut?" The county clerk, standing near the file cabinet with a folder in his hand, answered before Nora could. "That tree's been gone longer than she's been alive." A neighbor waiting by the door for his own business added, not unkindly, just certain, "A dead tree doesn't water cows." Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. They had already decided, the three of them, without needing to say so out loud. And Nora understood that as well as anyone in the room. They were right about the tree. They were wrong about why it had been written down. If stories about old land, old paper, and the people who read both more carefully than anybody expects belong to your kind of channel, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. It was 1986, in hill country along the Missouri-Kentucky line, and Nora Bell Haskins was 25 years old. Her father had died the winter before, leaving her the 74 acres he had worked his whole life, 28 acres of rough pasture, 18 of brush and cedar, 12 of lower hayfield, and 9 acres of rocky slope nobody had ever tried to do much with. Her mother had gone to live with her sister 2 counties over. Nora had stayed, the youngest of the family, and the one nobody had expected to hold the place together, and she had spent 2 years before her father's death keeping books at the courthouse clerk's office, which meant she could read old land records better than most of the men who farmed the ground those records described. She was not loud, and she had never been the one men in that county turned to first when land talk started. In meetings like the one at the bank, she had learned to expect being talked past rather than talked to. The banker addressing his questions to the air above her shoulder, as though an uncle or a husband might materialize to answer for her. More than once that spring, a neighbor had asked whether she had a man helping her decide before he would answer a question she had asked directly. She did not argue those moments away. She wrote things down instead, in the notebook she carried everywhere, the same habit that had made her useful at the clerk's office in the first place. The note against the farm still carried a balance of $6,800. Without a documented water source, the bank would not carry it much longer on the terms her father had held. A drilled well, by the only quote she had gotten, would run $9,650 once casing, pump, and wiring were added in. Hauling water through a dry summer, at the going rate that year, would cost $44 a day. Either number was more than the farm could carry without selling down her father's herd of 19 cow-calf pairs, and Nora was not ready to do that 2 years into holding the place on her own. The banker gave her 21 days to prove usable stock water existed on the farm, or he would recommend the note be called against the herd. At the coffee counter that week, the talk was not cruel, just certain, in the way small counties get certain about things. That deed was written when men measured land by trees and guesses. If the walnut is gone, the water is gone. You can't borrow against a sentence. No well means no cattle. Nora did not argue any of it out loud. She wrote most of it down in the small notebook she carried, the way she had been taught to record a fact whether or not she liked what it said. The deed description ran in the old style, the kind surveyors used before anyone drew springs on a map. Beginning at the south stone corner, thence north by the marked lane to the black walnut, with water at the walnut, thence west along the ridge. Everyone who read it treated the walnut as a boundary marker, nothing more. The kind of living postmen used before iron stakes were common. Nora read the same line differently. A deed did not add the word water beside a tree unless the tree had meant more than a boundary. Men did not waste ink on decoration in a legal description. If it said water at the walnut, water had been there for someone to write down. The walnut was not the water. It was the sign men used before maps learned to draw springs. She started where the deed started, At the south stone corner, a pile of fieldstone half buried under a stand of honeysuckle that had grown up over it for decades. She pulled the vine back by hand until the stones showed clean, counted them the way her father once had, and satisfied herself this was the same corner the deed had been written from more than half a century before. From there she measured out the old chain distance written into the description, pacing it by hand since there was no chain left in the family to measure it the way her grandfather would have, counting her steps twice to be sure of the distance before she trusted it. There was no lane left standing, not the kind you could see from a truck window, but there was a shallow depression running through the grass where wheels and hooves had once worn a path, a line of cedar trees growing at an angle that did not match the rest of the fence row, 2 fence posts rotted down to stubs, and a gap in the old stone wall where a gate had once hung. She followed the depression the way she might follow a sentence, one word at a time, trusting that the ground remembered what the deed described, even if nobody living did. The first walnut she found at the end of that line turned out to be the wrong one. There were 2 other old stumps on that ridge from trees that had died over the years, and she dug at the base of the nearest one for the better part of an afternoon, before admitting to herself that the roots underneath were bone dry. A neighbor passing along the road stopped long enough to take in what she was doing. "How many dead trees does it take to water a cow?" he asked, and did not wait for an answer before driving on. She found the real one 2 days later, further along the depression than she expected, marked by a low mound in the ground, a black rotted stump hidden under leaves, a scatter of old walnut shells worked into the soil, and a ring of young walnut sprouts growing up around the spot the way walnuts do when a parent tree has dropped its last crop and died. She cleared the leaves back with her hands and found the ground beneath cooler than the ground around it, the moss a shade greener, and a few flat stones lying in a pattern too even to have fallen there by accident. She dug carefully, by hand trowel, not expecting much and not getting much. No water pushed up to meet her, only damp stone and mud that darkened her fingers. She set a bucket under the dampest spot and left it overnight. In the morning there were a few inches of water in the bottom, nothing more. That won't water a chicken, the same neighbor told her when she mentioned it at the store. She had found the walnut. She had not found enough water to make anyone listen. The county clerk, when she brought the deed back in to ask whether the language carried any legal weight, told her plainly that old descriptions like that one were common and rarely meant to establish a water right in any way a modern bank would recognize. It could be read as description, not entitlement. The banker's answer, when she told him what she had found so far, was almost the same sentence in different words. A phrase is not a water source. With her days running out, and her uncle telling her over supper that she was chasing a dead tree to save a note that a live man ought to be handling, Nora went back to the courthouse a second time, not for the deed itself but for whatever else might sit alongside it in the file. She found what she was looking for in an old estate inventory, filed decades earlier by a previous owner, a single line noting that a spring box at the Walnut had been repaired in 1941. In a small notebook of her father's she had kept without reading closely, until now she found a line in his handwriting from years before he died. Walnut spring, weak when leaves choke stone mouth, clear after first frost. The spring had not disappeared. It had been swallowing its own water under 40 years of leaves. She drove out to see Amos Pike, 71 years old, a retired wellman who had built stone spring houses across 3 counties before anyone in that part of the country owned a drill rig capable of going deep. He listened to her without much on his face until she showed him the deed, and then he read the line twice before he said anything. Men didn't write water in a deed, he said, unless somebody had carried a bucket there. They worked it by hand over the better part of a week. They cut back the briars that had grown thick over the low ground. They found, under a flat slab Nora had assumed was just another stone in the pile, the top of a stone-lined box built into the hillside, the kind of small structure a man built once, by hand, when a spring needed protecting from silt and stock. They cleared out walnut roots that had grown down into the box over the decades, along with years of leaf silt packed in tight enough to seal the water in rather than let it out. They opened a clay overflow channel, laid a bed of clean gravel, fitted a screen over the mouth of the box, and ran a line down to a used stock tank set below the spring on the old lane. They fenced the spring itself so cattle could not get close enough to foul it, and set the trough low enough that the float valve would hold a working level without ever letting it run dry. The water did not come rushing back. It came back slowly, the way water does when it has been trapped rather than gone. It did not come back like a miracle. It came back like a clock someone had forgotten to wind. The numbers Nora worked out on a legal pad before she ever called Amos Pike were plain enough to hold up in front of a banker. A new drilled well would have run $6,900 for the hole itself, another $2,100 for casing, pump, and wiring, and $650 more for tank and line. Close to $9,650 total, money the bank was not going to lend against unproven ground. Hauling water at $44 a day across a typical 68-day stretch of summer would run close to $3,000, not counting fuel and the hours it took out of every day. Restoring the Walnut Spring, by contrast, cost her $24 in courthouse copies, $180 for the survey, help she hired to confirm the chain measurements, $260 for Amos Pike's time, $110 in hand-clearing labor she paid a young man from down the road to help with, and $340 more in gravel, screen, and pipe, plus $225 for the used tank and $190 for fence and gate materials. The total came to just over $1,300. After the box was cleaned and the overflow reopened, the flow measured out to about 1 4/10 gallons a minute, close to 2,000 gallons a day by theoretical output, more than enough once it was captured and stored properly to water 22 to 30 head in rotation without waste. The appraisal on the farm before any of this had run between $14,800 and $16,500 for 74 acres of dry ridge ground. After the spring was documented and working, the same farm appraised between $26,000 and $29,000, a swing in collateral value of $11,000 to $13,000, depending on which figure the bank chose to use. The dead walnut did not make Nora rich. It made the bank stop calling her farm dry. August came in hard and dry that year, the way it had a habit of doing in that part of the country. Ponds on the neighboring farms dropped low enough to show cracked mud at the edges. The creek at the bottom of the township ran barely a trickle. Cattle on the dry farms crowded into whatever shallow mud remained, and the local co-op did a steady business, selling tanks and hauling water to men who had never expected to need either. Nora's spring kept running. The trough filled overnight the way it had all summer, and she moved her cattle down the old lane each morning the way the deed had once described a lane being used, careful to keep them off the spring box itself, and drinking only from the trough below it. The banker drove out that August to see it for himself. The ground around the farm burned brown, same as everywhere else in the county, the old lane cleared and open, cattle standing at the trough below the dead walnut stump, the water clear and cold and steady. "That from the deed?" he asked. "From the walnut," Nora said. Neither of them said much more than that. It did not need more than that. The neighbor who had once asked how many dead trees it took to water a cow stood at the same fence line weeks later, looking at the stump differently than he had in the spring. "I used to think that was just where the old tree fell," he said. "It was where men stopped to water," Nora told him. The county clerk, filing the updated record that fall, changed the language on the file from no well of record to restored spring box near historic walnut marker. The banker never told Nora she had been right. He only changed the words on the note, the way men in that country did when they had been proven wrong without wanting to say so directly. What changed most was not the water. It was who people asked. Afterward, when they wanted to know how to read a piece of ground, Nora did not get louder. The water made people lower their voices. The walnut had been dead for 40 years. By the time Nora found it, there was no trunk left to mark a line, only a dark place in the ground, a ring of young sprouts, a few shells under the leaves, and one sentence in a deed everyone else had called old wording. But old wording had once been working language. Men wrote what mattered: Stone Corner, marked lane, black walnut, water. The bank had seen no well. The county had seen no record. The neighbors had seen a dead tree. Nora saw the word that did not belong there unless someone had once stopped to drink. She followed it, and in August, when the ponds went low and the ridge grass turned gray, the dead walnut watered cattle again. If this is the kind of story you come back for, there's a subscribe button below, and we'd like to know where you're watching from. Would you trust a modern county map or an old deed that says water at the walnut?